All right, guys, so next we're going to talk about fatigue. Fatigue is a hard thing to define for the research, right? We're not really sure what's the biggest driving mechanisms of fatigue, but it does come down to a lot of the nervous system in general, right? The nervous system, when you're talking about the central nervous system, we're thinking about neural drive. Central nervous system is connected to the brain, and that's going to drive all these capacities here that create fatigue. Central nervous system fatigue seems to be more generated towards longer endurance, higher volume type of training, and that's where a lot of this stuff comes into play with their ability to implement and cause fatigue, but also understanding the dynamics that the brain plays within the central nervous system is going to be crucial, because one of the confounding things when we think about VO2 maxes and long distance endurance and those type of performance markers, Timothy Noakes talks a lot about the brain being the central governor of what dictates your ability to generate fatigue and how you fatigue from exercise, right? With the basic understanding that the principle that we have now is that the heart starts to get fatigued, and then by it fatiguing, you have anaerobiasis, which happens within the muscles, and then the muscles start to become fatigued as well. But if you look at the research and the literature, there's no way that the muscle should be interacting like that before the heart does, so that we know that there has to be some confounding factor, and that's going to be from the heart to the brain. The brain's kind of telling you to govern things down, and that shift is what's going to focus the central nervous system and fatigue, and that feeling and that sense of fatigue to start to come up. Right? And this happens motivationally with a lot of people. If we look at some of the research they just did comparing fatigue of a squat and a deadlift, a lot of people would tell you a deadlift's going to be more fatiguing on them, when in fact they fatigued at the same amount. Even though the deadlift actually lifted more load, it still created the same amount of fatigue as a squat did that lifted less load. The reason the fatigue feels like it, or the deadlift feels like it's more fatiguing, is because it just feels harder, it feels heavier. And as you're going into those exercises and things feel that way, the motivation and the drive to continue to do that starts to decrease. And that's telling you that it's your brain more so than the actual muscles and the actual nervous system. That's the thing that's depleting. But before we get into more of the neural drive, we also have the peripheral nervous system, and this seems to be more muscular focused. So we're thinking about things that can create peripheral nervous system fatigue. We're going to think about muscle damage, metabolite buildup, your hydrogen ions, your lactate, and all those things that come with the higher volume metabolite type of buildup that also lends itself to central nervous system fatigue as well. So these kind of go hand in hand, but muscle damage has been shown. So any type of ability to drive muscle damage through novel stimulus has been shown to have a decrease in force production. That decrease in force production is driven mostly through peripheral nervous system, mostly through the muscles. So that's the thing you want to think about is, do you really want to induce muscle damage if that's not going to allow you to perform at the highest level the next time you go to the gym? The idea is, no, you don't want to do that. Muscle damage is not the king that tells you if your workout's good or not. You don't need to be sore in order to have a good workout. And then some of the other things is the actin-myosin cross bridge that you're going to have, that connection starts to be less and less, so your ability to produce force starts to diminish more and more. And then also your sarcoplasmic reticulum and your calcium, right? Calcium is one of the biggest drivers of muscle contraction within the calcium sodium pumps and those things. So that starts to get diminished as well. So that's where fatigue comes in from a peripheral nervous system standpoint. It's more muscular, and you'll see this a lot with bar speed. You'll see this a lot with vertical jump. You can have someone do a vertical jump as a baseline measurement, and then if they come into the gym, their vertical jump every time they do it should tell you if that person's fully recovered from a peripheral side of things. So if someone has a 30-inch vertical jump on baseline day one, and then they're 10 days in and they're still having a 30-inch vertical jump, that's telling you that their peripheral nervous system is fueled and ready to go. But once that starts to dip down to 27, 26, that's going to tell you that that's going to be a fatigue state, and that's what we need to work on, is maybe lowering the load and starting to increase the speed of movement to get that back on track, which takes anywhere between 4 to 10 days, depending on how fatigued or how damaged it is. Because when we're thinking about fatigue from an acute standpoint, right, any type of fatigue that we do encounter from a muscular standpoint, usually, even with the central nervous system, usually tends to resolve itself within the first 24 to 48 hours, even shorter than that, anywhere from 2 to 6 hours. So maybe these things aren't the things that confound long-term fatigue, and we don't really have an answer for that quite yet. But central nervous system fatigue, some ways to combat that is going to be, you have ammonia, right? Ammonia is going to be something that's broken down from protein, your protein balance. So making sure that you have a good amount of protein within your system, but not necessarily so much so that you have free form ammonia floating around, because then that can start to cause some issues with your brain being able to have those neural connections that you want. So understanding that some of the research shown when they added amino acids into the profile that didn't necessarily improve their ability to produce long-term performance gains, but when they add carbohydrates into the program, they were able to sustain more performance for longer because they didn't have to, remember, carbohydrates are protein sparing, so if you have carbohydrates in your system, your body doesn't have to break down protein, so you're not going to get as much ammonia. If you don't have much ammonia flowing through the brain, then you're not going to be as fatigued. And then we also have 5-HT, which is serotonin. That seems to be one of the biggest drivers of central nervous system fatigue within the brain. So thinking about that and how can we reduce our serotonin, serotonin's that here and now molecule compared to dopamine, which is that fight or flight, trying to go take action, go get something done. Serotonin's like we want to relax, we want to be as calm as possible. So as soon as that starts to get elevated in the body, our ability to perform at a high level tends to diminish. And that can be coincided with your ability to have as much muscle glycogen within the body as possible. So if we're fully restored with muscle glycogen and we're trying to restore that as we're training, we're not going to have such a release of 5-HT throughout the system when we do start exercising. And then acetylcholine, that's the biggest driver of muscle contraction when it comes to any type of movement, especially with endurance that has that repeated cyclical movement, right? We need acetylcholine to continue to synapse and continue to pop on actin as much as we can. So if that starts to diminish, then that can have a negative effect on your ability to produce force and have those muscle contractions. And then dopamine, if that's down as well, then you don't have that sudden urge, that sudden drive of performance to want to get things done. And then cytokines also related to your immune system. If those are out of whack, that's going to cause central nervous system fatigue as well. So that's why with acetylcholine, you'll see a lot of people start to play with some choline and dopaminergic type of supplements. You can think about nicotine, you can think about things along that line that are choline producers that can help improve endurance performance because it's going to give you more free form acetylcholine within the body. Same thing with trying to take L-Dopa or something like that that can be broken down to dopamine. That's going to allow for more dopamine and more acetylcholine within the body, which is going to allow for less central nervous system fatigue while you're doing these type of endurance sports. So these are the two main mechanisms when we're thinking about fatigue. Everything is going to be auto-regulated through the brain, obviously being able to sense motivation. If you find ways to enjoy training, if you find variations within your training that still drive that adaptation, that's going to increase your motivation to go to the gym. And by doing that, you're going to notice that you're going to have less quote unquote fatigue throughout your weeks of training. So if you're highly enthusiastic about training, and that's why we talk about if you have a good program that you really love doing, that's going to produce better results than the best program in the world that you hate doing, because you want to have that excitement, you want to have that level of motivation to get to the gym. That's powered by your brain, and your brain regulates all these other things and all these other pathways. So fatigue could be mostly related to the brain, but it can also be related to central nervous system, endurance type stuff, higher volume training. That's going to deplete these more so than peripheral nervous system, which is explosive power and strength. That's going to be depleted through these. Calcium is one of the biggest drivers of strength and of your ability to have explosive movements. So we want to think heavy singles doesn't necessarily deplete your nervous system, your central nervous system. It's going to deplete your peripheral nervous system more. Higher volume, that's going to deplete your central nervous system more. So dictated on how you feel, right? If you feel really sluggish, you feel like you're kind of depleted within your glycogen stores, or if you feel like your hand grip strength or anything like that starts to diminish, that's going to tell you that your nervous system is going to be a little bit fried. Or if you're lacking stability, right? Anything that has a neural drive component, that's going to be central nervous system fatigue. If you're starting to feel that, then you want to start to decrease your volume. That's where that decrease in volume deload comes into place. Here with peripheral nervous system, you may want to decrease your ability to lift heavy weight, right? So singles maybe starting to slow you down. So you maybe want to start doing some more dynamic speed type stuff to get that bar moving faster. And then that can help replenish your peripheral nervous system. And then fatigue in and of itself as a mechanism driver of a need to reduce volume or deload, that's not quite unknown, or that's unknown now. So we're trying to think about ways to continue to facilitate that. It's going to be through nutrition. It's going to be through understanding how these volume landmarks affect these two types of nervous systems, and then combining that all together with sleep, with stress relief. If you can get all that stuff down, the likelihood that you're going to be fatigued a lot is going to be diminished, right? Your 4-week training blocks are now going to be extended to 8-week to 12-week training blocks. You're not going to need that deload that you used to need every 3 weeks when you can get all this stuff in line.